Hello, my name is Keegan.
And my name is Keely. Welcome to History from Horseback. Today we are pleased to be welcoming a guest to the podcast. Once again, very exciting.
Dr. Shelby Landmark is a scholar of media studies, gender and sexuality, disability, and of late, horses. She is currently the Mellon Humanities Postdoctoral Fellow for Disability Representation at National Historic Sites, located at the home of Franklin D. Roosevelt in the Hudson Valley area of New York, which is a long title, but basically means she researches, writes, and creates public programs about FDR and his disability. This led her to researching the many Roosevelts and their many horses, including how they were used for early therapeutic purposes. She's also a self-proclaimed and loud and proud horse girl. Please welcome Shelby.
Hi, thank you for having me.
This is going to be one of those episodes where I learn a lot, I feel. I
Me
just know it.
too.
Oh no.
So, to start, we'll throw open with a really easy one. How did you get started with horses?
Thank goodness it's an easy one. Um,
Yeah.
I grew up with horses. I think the first time I was ever put on one, I couldn't walk. So really young, really early. My grandparents owned a rodeo arena, and it was also a barbecue and a shoe repair place. So they had a lot going on, but my dad grew up roping, pretty at a high level, and he taught my sister and I how to ride, and we definitely grew up in the Western tradition, rodeos and such. And I also grew up um, with a horse that I got as a foal and basically trained her myself as a starting as a 7-year-old. And so she was what we would call customized. So I could get her to do whatever I wanted, but like probably nobody else could.
That's
Which
amazing.
is not ideal because I thought, oh, I have all this experience with horses and now I'm an adult. And I started taking English lessons and I was like, oh my gosh, I know nothing. I even used to like barrel race as a kid and do poles. And so I was, competing, but the equitation involved in that is completely different. And so now I'm an adult and I'm thankfully at a point in my life where I can take lessons. And so it's like I'm a kid again. So that's kind of my overview.
I relate to that so much. I like got to the age where I was an adult and I was like, you know what? Actually, I'm of an age where I can just pay for this myself and do this myself. So I'm gonna go and
Yeah,
do this.
it's
And it was
great.
awesome. Yeah, it was great.
I'm just curious about how was that kind of shift from Western to English? I know you talked a little bit about it, but
It was like a train wreck, actually. It was like it happened pretty much all at once. I realized all at once. So I hadn't rode. We sold our horses when I was probably 16, just because my sister and I were doing other sports and other activities, and we weren't devoting the time to our horses as we should have. So my dad sold them, and I didn't ride again until I was like 25, I think. So 10, almost 10 years.
Yeah,
And
well.
it was I found this organization called Wild Women, and they do like women and femme only trips. And I thought that's a great way to travel by myself because I couldn't find anybody who also wanted to go on like an adventure style vacation and could afford it and whatever. And so um, I decided like, oh, I would feel safe going on a trip with just women. And they had this trip that was in Scotland, and you stay in like a historic farmhouse and you meet lots of local craftsmen and do lots of local activities and stuff. But then every day also you ride horses. And so it was like you get to explore the area, but it's also a horse riding trip. And so when you apply for the trip, they ask you what experience you have. And I was like, oh, I have, this many years, 10, 10 plus years of riding experience my whole life. I used to compete, I'm good. Uh, and so I said I was like intermediate, which was required for that trip because there's lots of beach rides, beach galloping and up mountainous passes. And it was like really kind of precarious. And I got on the horse when I got there, and I quickly realized I didn't know what I was doing and I didn't know what the buttons were. And so they were really kind and they gave me a crash course. And I had a very patient horse who, kind of just ignored me when I was asking for the wrong things. Um, I did fall off once, which was the first time I'd fallen off since I was a kid. And that was my fault. And it just, it was like, oh my God, I just suddenly realized I know nothing about this. And I was determined when I get back to the States, I'm going to learn how to ride correctly and in the English style. Because I don't mean correctly as if Western's wrong. I just mean I love this style. I love how it helps you communicate with the horse and much more clearly than I ever learned. And I was determined. And so now that I'm back in the States, it took about a year, but I found a couple of places I could take lessons. And so I've been doing that for maybe 4 months. And I feel like I am at day one still. Like there's still so much to learn. But I'm having so much fun.
It's one of those things. Riding horses is so humbling.
Yeah, that's a good word for that. I feel
Yeah.
humbled every time.
Yeah. I tell a story really often of a lesson horse that humbled the absolute life out of me when I was very, very new to my lessons, and I got on her and she walked me to the middle of the arena and stopped, and I was like, "Oh, I have no idea what I'm doing." So that was fun. But the second time I got on her, like 6 months later, I knew what I was doing, and it was a way better experience. And I knew all the buttons, and it was awesome. And
It's weird how
turns out
that works.
yeah, and it's like, oh, she's a great horse. She knows exactly what she's doing. It's just on the day when I first had her, I had no clue what I was doing, and she had no clue what I was telling her to do. So it's like one of those things where you're like, oh, hang on. When people say the horse can't understand you, they mean it. Like, it's not just that they're ignoring you. Like, they're not being malicious. They just have no clue what your little baby legs are telling them to do. It was great.
So, what first got you interested in the Roosevelts and their relationships with horses? What inspired you to want to write a book about them or study them in general?
Yeah, that's a good question with a long answer. I'll try to keep short. Um, I have a PhD in communication, and communication is really a broad field. And so I always have to like specify what I mean by that. I studied media representation, and so it's how we communicate in media. And more specifically, I studied how we communicate about people with disabilities in media. So, how are they represented? Is it positive? Is it negative? Is it patronizing? Is it blah, blah, blah? Um, so, that's what I studied and got my PhD in. And I found this postdoc position through the National Park Service. It's a Mellon Postdoctoral Fellowship. So that's why it's such a long title because there's like four organizations involved in it. But basically, I'm stationed at a national park site, which is the home of FDR. So it's where President Franklin Delano Roosevelt grew up and lived, where his parents lived, before he was born. And he had paralysis. He had a disability because he had polio. So that's why I came here to help them work on how they talk about his disability, to research, new information about his disability we haven't learned before, stuff like that. And while I was doing that, I learned that horses were a part of that story. And even bigger than that, horses are a huge part of the Roosevelt family story. And specifically, I mean the Roosevelts as in Franklin Roosevelt. A lot of people, when you talk about Roosevelts and horses, people think Teddy Roosevelt, which is fair, but Franklin had his own passion for horses and grew up with them, and his dad also, and his mom and his mom's parents, and it was a huge part of their family. And it was just like I was felt overwhelmed in the amount of information that I was finding. And I work at such an amazing place because not only do we have the house and we have an incredible collection storage facility with like riding equipment and things that they used around the farm, we also have right next door the FDR Presidential Library, which has all of his papers. And all of Eleanor Roosevelt's papers, and just like it's incredible what the resources have. what I have as far as resources go around here. Um, so there's no shortage of avenues for me to research. We also have an incredible stable that was built in, I think, 1866, in the mid 1800s. And I just remember walking in and thinking like, why isn't everyone coming here and looking at this? They're wanting to come. Most people want to come and they want to look at the house that the people lived in. And I'm like obsessed with the stable and I want to know the story of the horses whose names are still above their stall doors. So anyways, that's kind of how I got into the horses here. So there's a broad Roosevelt family horse story, but specifically FDR got polio. He became partially paralyzed for the rest of his life. And most people tell the story in the way that implies, or they sometimes just explicitly say, he couldn't ride anymore after that. He couldn't do this, this, and this. And it's true, he had to change his life after he became paralyzed. But I was finding all of these photos of him on horseback on dates that occur after he had paralysis. So it was like this, there's something undiscussed here, something that is not as commonly known. And so I started looking into it, and FDR had a rehabilitation center in Georgia called Warm Springs, and it was the first polio rehabilitation center in the world, or at least in the States, but I think in the world too. And they had horses there. And there's photos and videos of FDR riding horses at this physical rehabilitation center in the 1930s and in the 1920s, which is really early for equine assisted therapy, which didn't become a discipline until I think the 60s or the 70s, like a formalized discipline. Um, so he could have I think he had a role, or he at least deserves recognition that he knew that this was something that could help people with their physical therapy way before a lot of people knew it.
That's really cool. Growing up in the US, at least, like when we were learning US history, I definitely kind of never saw a photo of FDR on a horse. Um,
Yeah.
so it's kind of incredible that he had this whole part of his life that really isn't discussed. I mean, because I guess it doesn't
Mhm.
really fit into that narrative. The narrative that people with disabilities are helpless or that it's kind of like seen as this hard line of like, oh, they could do things and now they can't at all, when
Right.
often it's much more gray than that.
How do people react when you tell them that that's where you are and that's what you're doing? Like when you're because you're in that building. Like that's insane. That's such a wild. Australia doesn't have a lot of historical landmarks, and the historical landmarks that we do have are quite young because, in terms of, Western civilization anyway. Uh,
Right.
so, we don't have a lot of these sorts of historical buildings and whatnot. And I know that Americas aren't all that old in the grand scheme of things either, compared to places like Europe and whatnot. But even compared to us, they're still a way a lot older. So,
I really don't talk too much about the horses as part of my job. My boss is probably, when he listens to this, he's going to laugh because we joke that I never shut up about the horses. Um, but really, I'm here to study FDR's disability, and this kind of came about as a side thing. Um, and so I don't have a lot of opportunities to talk about it, which is why I started the Instagram account, is because I wanted to share more about it. Um,
mm,
anyways, but it's a long story, how I got here, why I'm here. I get mixed reactions. Some people are like, this is great. We need to reevaluate what we think we know about this, really important historical figure, arguably one of the, most beloved presidents of all time. Um, but people, you know, he's because he's beloved, people have very strong emotional attachments to the stories they've heard.
mm,
And
yeah.
so I try to approach how I talk about FDR and his disability and his life in a way that's more, it's not sensationalized, it's not, sticky sweet, it's not glossing over the negative parts of him either. It's just kind of matter of fact. And I will say, I do have a bias now where I am fond of him as a historical figure, but I just try to treat things like his disability and stuff like that as this was just a part of his life.
Mm,
And at this site, which is his home, it's, we really aren't supposed to be doing much more than just saying this was a part of his life. It was well known that this was part of his life, and here's how he lived with it. And part of
Yeah.
how he lived with it was with horses. And that was, he went to this rehabilitation center multiple times a year. Um, and people talk a lot about how he used swimming to regain muscle strength. And that is true that that's something he did every day, but riding horses was also a part of it too. And he did say like, I'm getting my physical health back from riding horses. Um, he said that to a newspaper reporter. Um, I say all of that because when I have shown people some of the pictures of him riding and shown them the dates on it, and you can just tell he has some paralysis. You can see it. You can kind of see his leg
Yeah.
braces. You can kind of see the way he's sitting.
Yeah.
Um, People sometimes respond to that in a way that's like, well, maybe they just put him up there to take the photo and then they've got him off. Because there's a narrative around FDR that's probably the most common narrative, which is that he wanted to like trick people into thinking that he didn't have a disability, which is a whole other
Uh,
tangent. We
yeah.
don't really need to get into that. That's kind of
Yeah.
the essential nature of my postdoc is to deal with that narrative,
Yeah, okay.
which I'll say right now, there's not a lot of evidence for that. Um,
Yeah.
it's very well documented that he used mobility devices in public and people knew about it and he talked about it and whatever. But when people see the pictures on the horses, I've gotten responses that are like, well, he was just doing that for like to make himself look able-bodied. And I think that's really not fair to this, not only to what he said, his own
Mm.
words were, I'm using this as to get my physical health back, but also when we look at his life and the amount of time he spent with horses prior to having polio, it makes sense that that would continue to be part of his life. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And also, like, if it's something that he genuinely enjoyed and got a lot of enjoyment out of, like, why would he stop?
Yeah.
And just kind of talking back about that kind of narrative, I do feel like there is kind of this for a lot of able-bodied people, the idea of becoming disabled in some way is like a nightmare for them, and so they
Yeah.
can't imagine it not being absolutely terrible and a nightmare for someone else.
Yes.
And then when they see something that kind of disproves that, it's hard for them to deal with.
Yeah.
Because we're kind, it's kind of this thing that's spread that like, oh, your good health is the most important thing when it's
Mhm.
really more of a spectrum. It's not just like, oh, you're perfectly healthy or you're like, you know,
Dead.
yeah. Yeah.
Right. Well, I spend a lot of time thinking about and advocating for others to think about or to consider disability and health as separate things because there's a lot of overlap, but when people would ask FDR about his health and he would respond, "I'm healthy," a lot of times that's been pointed to as like, "Look, there it is. He's lying." Because at the whole time he said that, he was, crippled, which is the words they would use at the time. So he's lying and whatever. And it's like the fact was he was healthy. He just also had paralysis. Like he wasn't sick anymore. He didn't have polio anymore. He was recovered from that. So that wasn't a lie. Um, but he had paralysis. And one thing that's really incredible to me about the horse pictures is, and I think this is where me having experience with horses adds to my role here in changing this narrative, is that I know you need a little bit of, core strength to hold yourself up.
Hmm.
And he often gets discussed as like, you're either completely paralyzed and disabled or you're completely not. And he doesn't get enough credit for how much he could do and how much strength he still did have. Um, and he obviously had enough to sit on top of a horse. Still haven't figured out how he got up there. Um, but he had enough to be able to sit up there and ride.
Well, plus like when people say that, I'm like, have you seen the Paralympic
Yeah.
competitors? Like they're
Yeah.
they're doing like extremely advanced dressage. Go
the
ahead.
gear that they use is being only being developed better and better every year, like with them doing better and getting further and whatnot, and people coming up with new things that help, like even basic things like Keegan, we were talking about those gel pads like that go under saddles recently for because I know that Maya Vance is a huge, like she talks about those all the time, and they've been instrumental for her injury and getting back into riding and doing better. But yeah, like even just like the technology that goes into gear and tack and stuff is getting up there with in terms of like how it can assist and do better and whatnot. So
Yeah, I actually went to Briarfest last summer,
that
if
would
you're
have been
familiar.
so fun. Yes, I saw TikToks about it. I was like, oh, everyone looks like they're having a great time.
It was incredible, and I can't wait to go back. But I went specifically because the theme that year was disability related. It was
That's
called
cool.
Against All Odds. And so the horses that they were featuring were like horses that were blind but were doing show jumping, or people who were blind and but were doing show jumping. And so I was like, I have to go because this is like
Yeah.
tangentially related to my work and just my also personal interests. And it was so fascinating. There was a group of girls there who were advocating for show jumping to be considered a Paralympic sport. Because right now, I think the only para equestrian sport is dressage.
Yeah.
Um, and they were talking about how people are like, well, you have, a disability, you can't jump. And so they had a demo with all these different girls who have completely different kinds of physical disabilities who have, some kind of tack modification often. Um, and they're able to show jump. And it was incredible. And anyways,
Yeah.
this just plug for Briarfest. That was really, really
I bet the
enlightening.
I bet the custom models would have been really good too. Oh, it would have been so cool. Do you have a favorite historical person or horse from your research? Could you possibly pick just one of them?
Oh, I love this question. Do I have to pick one? Um, okay, person mm, besides FDR, because I think that's obvious. I'll say his father, James. So James Roosevelt the first. Everybody gets named the same name in these like old money families, So there's quite a few James Roosevelts, but FDR's father, James, I've really come to love him. I don't know if you can like feel love for someone who died like way, way, way before you were born, but he was just such an animal person. I feel really connected to him in that way. And he, as far as I've seen, was a really gentle person with the horses, which is not quite common for that time period. Uh,
Yeah, for sure.
but he was really interested in harness racing, which I've learned in the last year what that is. I wasn't familiar. I really wasn't even familiar with like gated breeds beyond Icelandics. I had no idea there was this whole sport and this whole world. And actually, this area of the Hudson Valley in New York is like a hotspot for it.
Oh, cool.
So he was one of these, rich gentlemen who was involved in the sport in the mid 1800s. And he had a very famous horse that he bred named Gloucester. And I just posted about this on my social media, so you might have seen it. But I'll tell you, I'll combine the question where these are favorite person and favorite horse story. I should also preface this with saying I also like a lot of true crime and I like a gory story. So this story does get a little bit,
Yeah,
I'm also
cool.
a
it's a little
Yeah,
dicey.
I'm
Okay,
also a true crime nerd, so
great. Okay. So people hear me tell this story sometimes and they're like, ugh, why do you like that? I'm like, it's fascinating.
I
Anyways,
I get that. When you're like, this is a really cool story, and they're like, ugh. You're like, oh,
so
okay.
here's how I found out about this story. Um, I was talking to my boss, Frank Futrell, who's the curator here, and he was like, "Oh yeah, we have a horse's tail that FDR had in the collections. So it's not on display; it's in the storage." And I was like, "I'm sorry, what?" He's like, "Yeah, it used to hang on a plaque, and we found a picture of it." And I was like, when he said that he has a horse's tail, I was picturing, how when somebody's horses, you have to put your horse down, they cut their tail, and then you keep it, and it's you cut the hair of the tail, right? You're not
Yeah.
cutting the entire tail off, right?
Oh boy.
So he's like, there's a taxidermied tail that FDR had that belonged to a horse. And I was like, hold the phone. What is this about? Um, and I can't, off the top of my head, I can't remember exactly what my research process was, but I figured out that it was this horse that had died, according to FDR, in a train wreck that belonged to his father, which is a crazy story. And I went to the archives, I found the primary sources where FDR himself was saying this was the horse, he died in a train wreck. So I was pretty confident as a historian, like, okay, there's multiple sources for this. I was pretty confident this is what happened. I found out that there's a harness racing museum about 20 minutes away from here. So I called them and I talked to their librarian, and he was like, well, first I was just like, do you have any information on the Roosevelts? Because I know they were kind of into this sport. And he said, no, and I love this response. He said, if you have the horse's name, I probably can find information about them in our
That's
records.
of
Which I love
course.
that.
Of
I love that they're
course.
like identifying the horses instead of the people,
Yeah.
especially for a family that's so famous as the Roosevelts. So he called me back and he's like, yeah, I have a file on this horse. So I was like, please, can I come see it? Um, so I drove over there and I spent the day, and it was really incredible. If you're in the area, please go see the Harness Racing Museum. It's a lot of fun and informative. Even if you're not a horse nerd like me, it's cool. But they have records for going all the way back to the origins of this sport. And they had a file on this horse. And it was so crazy because I was talking to the librarian and I was like, yeah, FDR said he died in a train wreck. And he was like, no, he didn't. And I was like, well, FDR said it. So, like, I'm gonna believe FDR, right? And he goes, well, I have the horse's autopsy records here. So I know that's not what happened. And I was like,
That's
what?
incredible.
Who has an autopsy record on a horse from who died in 1874, you know? So I got to see it. It was incredible. The horse broke some records. I don't really understand everything about the sport, but he was big and he was fast, I guess. Or he was big and he had long stride, and so he won a big race at Rochester. I don't know. I don't even think FDR's father owned him at that time. He sold him to another trotting enthusiast who then sold him for a lot of money to a senator in California who was interested in starting his own training program and breeding program. Um, so Gloucester won. The horse won this race, won a couple things. I think he broke a record. It wasn't a long-lived record, but it was, I guess, important at the time. Important enough that in these horse newspapers that they had at the time, they were people knew him by name. So he gets sold. He gets on a train with, I think, a groom and a driver. So one of the people, the guys who like actually races the horses in the little sulky seat, who was also famous, and they traveled with this horse who was sold for an astronomical amount of money in, 1874. And they traveled with him on this train, and at some point on the train, probably he caught what they called lung fever at the time, which we think is just pneumonia. And he had made it to San Francisco, so he'd made it to California. And in the newspapers, or they reported the veterinarian's diary from when he was taking care of Gloucester, and he kept really detailed records that was like, his blood pressure was this, his fever today was this,
Wow.
he coughed, this is what he ate today. He, was restless today, or today he laid down a lot, or like it was really in depth. So they reported this daily record of Gloucester's illness, and he was sick for 14 days, really high fever. They tried all kinds of treatments on him, including like putting mustard leaves on his chest. I don't know what that would do, but they tried that. They had these really long, I forget what they're called, but they're like really large needles, and they put them in his thoracic cavity to like drain fluid. And
Like
this is like 18.
acupuncture or
No, it was like deeper than that. It was like in the
wow.
thoracic cavity to drain fluid, possibly in his lungs to drain fluid. I'm not sure. I had to Google it and I saw that that's what that treatment was. And I was like, wow, that's pretty serious. So they were doing everything that medicine at the time, veterinary medicine at the time, could do for him. But unfortunately, he did pass away. And I think because, if I had to guess why all of this happened, he was so well known and he was worth so much money that that's why they did the autopsy to see, had this guy bought like a bad investment, I guess. Which pneumonia you can't really prevent, I guess, but he did actually have tuberculosis, they think. So he probably would have
Oh,
died
wow.
anyways.
Wow.
Yeah.
Secondary, I think, to the lung fever. But um, they also reported in the newspapers the results of the autopsy, which was really gross. And you can read all about that if you want. I can send it to you, but I won't share it here because it is like autopsy gross. But um, a large crowd of, I think they said a large crowd of persons in the newspaper gathered around and watched it. So they did the autopsy at the racetrack. And I think they had a
Wow.
burial plot at the racetrack, which now that I think about it, probably implies that some of the horses died during the races. And that's why they were like, let's just bury them here, because
Yeah,
they didn't have like
probably.
Yeah,
tractors back then.
I was gonna say, yeah, I feel like that's been happening since the beginning of time.
Yeah, horrible. But so they did his autopsy there, and a lot of people watched it, and they reported his death announcement in the newspaper, and they said, "Honored be his ashes." Like they were so distraught
Oh.
about the death of this
Oh,
winning horse. Um, and so at some point, I don't know who made the decision to cut his tail off, but they did, and they also cut a hoof off, and the hoof was turned into an inkwell. And the tail, as I said, was taxidermied and mounted on a beautiful redwood plaque. And it has like gold paint with his name on it and when he died and his like record times. And they stayed in California until, so he died in 1874. FDR became president in 1933. He was inaugurated in 1933. In 1935, somebody from that family who had bought the horse sent FDR the tail, and he was quoted in the newspapers as saying, like, I'm so thrilled to have this because Gloucester is such an important name in our family. Like, this is an important story. Because this all happened obviously before FDR was born, but his dad obviously told him about it, and he had a, really fond relationship with his dad that involved horses. So this was a big story for him. So he kept the tail hanging in his White House bedroom until he died.
Wow.
And then when he died, Eleanor took it back. To Hyde Park to his family home, and that's where it is now. And I'm trying to get it to be on display in FDR's bedroom. So we're going to go scout out a location for that probably next week.
That's really
Um,
cool.
because I
yeah,
think
that would
other
be so
people would like
cool.
to see it, and I think FDR would want people to see it. And the weird thing is, too, when I went to the Harness Racing Museum, they have the hoof that was turned into an inkwell. So there's like a piece of him there. And of course they were like, if y'all don't want the tail, we'll take it. And I'm like, no, I don't want to give up our tail. But meanwhile, other people that I work with, like I finally got to see it this week, after hearing these stories and going on this journey with this horse.
Mhm.
Um, I finally got to see the tail, and the person who was showing it to me, the museum technician, she was gagging. She's not into taxidermy at all. And I was like, stimming. I was so excited,
Oh
like,
my God.
full autism excitement. I was like, this is the best, career highlight for me. And it's not even what I'm supposed to be doing, really.
I mean,
Anyways,
taxidermy can have a certain smell sometimes that people aren't the fondest of.
I was
I
gonna
will
say, can you
say,
imagine how musty it smelled from like opening the box the first time in probably however long?
well,
Like,
yeah, so the story with it is it's been preserved recently, as in the last 20 years. So it's in
oh
beautiful
wow.
Oh,
condition.
great.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. However, in the 80s, it used to hang in the stable outside with no temperature
Yeah.
control. So it was in pretty bad shape. But, there's still stuff out in that stable that's some of it is not cataloged just because people don't
Wow.
even either care or know what it is or,
Yeah.
have the time.
Mm.
But thankfully, somebody had the, wherewithal to remove it and put it into the temperature controlled storage unit.
Someone looked at it and thought, this is odd or strange enough that I think it needs to be put in storage.
It is quite strange. I've never heard of someone taxidermying a tail
Yeah,
of a
just the
Yeah.
horse.
tail.
Yeah,
Yeah,
like I've heard of the cutting the, hair part of the tail off. Like that's pretty common.
right.
I've never heard of like the whole tail and taxidermy.
Can I tell you one more story about a trotter? It's
Always.
shorter. So it's also about James, so FDR's father. So he bred these horses, and I should also say this is a big part of why I decided to write a book. the reason he purchased this property to build his home, to have his home, was because he thought it would be have enough pasture space and be good to breed trotting horses. So like the reason this national park site is here is because of horses, which I think is incredible. So anyways, so he was breeding them, and I forgot to say Gloucester was the grandson of Hambletonian, which was like the most famous sire, trotting sire at the time. I don't know. So he has an important legacy. I'm actually in the process of applying for him to be inducted into the Hall of Immortals at the Harness Racing Museum because he has this famous lineage and this famous story. But anyways,
Yeah.
I'm already getting off track. Okay. So FDR's father bred these horses. He decided to stop doing it because there was too much gambling going on, and I think he was too much of a like religious upright gentleman, and he said something
Mm,
about not liking how it's turning out. So he
yeah.
stopped participating. Um, but he still had at least one trotter. He liked to keep one to ride and probably a couple to, drive. And the last one that he had was named Doolittle, and I think he was a gelding. It was a boy, I think. Um, and FDR's father also had a sort of a disability, which is also not very known. He had a lot of heart failure. He had some kind of heart disease, and he had several heart attacks, and he had to use a wheelchair for the last few years of his life. And Doolittle was a very large horse, and I think he was too large for James to ride when he was very sick. So his wife, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, and their son, FDR, purchased a different horse for him, and they would put him on top of the horse and let him ride while he was like, really ill and couldn't hardly exercise, just so he could still enjoy that. And they would like lead the horse around, which I think is like an incredible disability and family horse story. But anyways, they still had Doolittle. When James died, Doolittle was, not young, but he still lived at least another year. And it was really hard for FDR's mother because she was like, this was your dad's beloved pet, and it's hard for me to let go of the horse. But the horse had at this point been of a certain age, and she said he was starting to get stiff-legged and not doing well. And so they ended up having to euthanize him with chloroform, which is crazy to me
That is
because
insane.
I guess that's what they did back then. But she wrote something really sweet that was like, it cost me a lot of feeling, she said, to have to put the horse down because this was your dad's last horse, and I know how much he loved him. Isn't that sweet?
Yeah.
That's that's
It's
really
like they're
They're
sweet.
such
like,
a horse family. That's really, yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, every single
Oh,
one of them was a horse person, and it's like they're no different than us. This was in the 1800s, but this was
but it was
we
hard.
all feel the same.
Yeah. No one wants to do it. No one wants to, like, especially for a time when, and I always try to explain this to people, the fact that during this time, people genuinely believed that animals didn't feel pain because they believed that they didn't have souls. So to have people who take in consideration of the animal's well-being and care and the fact that it could be uncomfortable or not doing well and whatnot, and to have them, put it first and make those decisions and stuff it's like, at least a few of them, or at least, there would have been families and stuff that, it would have been, they were family pets, and it would have been really difficult and stuff that, it's not all the hard stories that we hear where it's just like, no, they just shot it and moved on. And it's like, no, a few of them
Or
still would have really struggled and stuff.
or that they were just transportation at this time,
Yeah,
which
yeah,
they
exactly.
obviously
Like
were more than that.
machines. Mm,
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
it's kind of a funny tie-in because we just talked about Black Beauty,
Yeah,
Right.
and how Anna Sewell, she uh, couldn't walk. She lost
I didn't know
function of
that.
her, yeah, she lost function of her ankles at 14. And that's how she kind of got so connected to horses, was that they were her, I mean, they were the way that she accessed the world. Because she could still ride horses and she drove horses quite frequently. And, she ended up loving them so much and hating seeing all the mistreatment that she ends up writing Black Beauty as a way to call attention to it.
That's amazing. I didn't know that. I think this is like this is my heart story. Like this is the thing I love to hear. And if you've been around horses for a significant amount of time, I think people get it. Like you understand
Mhm.
how even if you don't have a, physical disability like that, they are healing and there's just something magical about them. And I would like to think that FDR and his family members, who almost all of them had a disability, turns out, I think that they knew it. They used
Mm.
horses as medicine for a lot of things besides just his paralysis.
Mm. So you kind of mentioned it a little bit before, where you talked a little bit about your research process, but I'm just curious if you could walk us through some of that process and where you find your information. This definitely isn't like a thinly veiled cry for help on my end or anything. Just,
Yeah. Well, I have to preface again by saying, like, I understand the privilege I have in being where I'm at. Like, I have access to information and materials that I know is like most people would never dream of having access to them. So the FDR Presidential Library is an incredible resource if you're in this area. They have a lot of digitized information, but I think they said like only like 6% maybe of all the documents and things that they have are digitized. So the majority is not, just because they have a ridiculous amount of things, correspondence and everything, but there's also photographs. And so I spend a lot of time in the archive research room just going through photographs. And so I've really had to learn how to do archival research and how to know what to look for and how to ask for it. But I will say most of the time I find things when I'm not looking for it. This is how this whole horse thing came about is I was researching FDR's disability and then I found all of this information about the horses. And so I, because the horses were such a prevalent part of their lives, they're everywhere. And almost, any resource you look in the letters, in their diaries, in their photographs, it's everywhere. And like I said, having the stable and the collection storage here, like I can go up to the stable and see things up there like the horses' names on their buckets. Their original buckets are still up there. And I can then use that to go, okay, I know the horses were had these names, and then I can follow that up at the library. So, I am sorry I don't have any advice because this is like a really niche
yeah, no,
but
that's okay.
plentiful place if you want to research the Roosevelts and their horses and horses in the Hudson Valley in general and the race horse history and the farming here is which is another thing I learned is that like, you know, in the 1800s, you had a stable, the nice stable for your driving horses, and then you
Mhm.
had your farmer tenants, and they had their own barns with draft horses. That was news to me. It's a really historically filled place.
That's cool. I guess I'll have to visit at some point.
You should. I can give you a tour,
Oh, that'd be awesome.
the horse tour.
Yeah. Yes, the special horse tour. But yeah,
Sorry,
no, just
Keely, if you want to come over for, I don't know how long the flight is, like 24 hours.
Yeah, don't worry. I married a German, so I'm no stranger to long flights. So planning it at some point. I've got to get over
Great, come
there
on over.
for an NATRC ride first, and
yeah.
then we'll be on our way to the Hudson Valley.
Yeah.
And I'll
Great.
just check them all off as we go. Be great.
Yeah. No, the reason I asked the question was just as like a science background person, it's kind of like research is kind of so different than, I mean, it's similar, but also different when you're trying to research like history, because often with science, it's like, all right, you've got scientific articles, like studies and papers, or then like if you need to research something, then you will go and you do that research.
Right.
Versus it's like history, it's so muddied with like, just with your Gloucester story of where it's like literally like FDR, I'm sure he wasn't trying to lie. It probably was
Right.
just like a family story that at some point, he got it mixed up or he was told the wrong thing. or even
Mhm.
like his father wanted to make it more exciting. The
Right.
um and so it's just like history gets so muddied and so
Yeah.
sometimes I'm like paranoid. I'm like, am I saying the right thing? Because this expert thinks it's one way and then this expert thinks it's another way.
I think that's a sign of a good historian, which I have to say, I don't have a degree in that. So I totally have now, the lived experience of doing this kind of research, but I wasn't trained in it. So I really had to learn on the fly. And what I had to learn was that history is interpreted. It's not just black or white. And how people interpret it affects then how it's learned and understood in the future. And that's why things like, FDR's disability has been interpreted as he would hide it. And that's been the story. And, I sourced one, I like to spend a lot of time in the footnotes. Anything I read, I'm like looking for their citations, like where did they get that? Which is
Hmm.
like the number one thing I can recommend for everybody, no matter what you read, nonfiction wise.
Hmm.
Um, and I was finding things that was like citing for evidence of this story, and I traced it back to a biographer who wrote a book about FDR in 1950, which is 5 years after he died. So that's not a very reliable source because of that. But then also, the newspaper he was citing as his primary source was not a real name. He had got it wrong. I figured out
Hmm.
what I think which name it was, and I was able to find that newspaper, and there was no quote in there from FDR about don't take pictures of me looking disabled. It wasn't in there. So this was like I was able to trace this like decades long misinformation, and what people do is they cite the biographer from 1950, and they're like, well, that's a
Hmm.
pretty old source. It's from a historian. We can trust it. But he got things wrong too. And so it's kind of like also, just like with riding horses, it's knowing like I'm going to get things wrong too. And I do, we all are going to get things wrong. And we just have to hope that people can, not take everything we say with like it's the gospel.
Hmm.
That's like one of the most frustrating things about looking for sources and things is that people just go, "Oh, it's old, it must be right." Like, "Oh, the older it is, the better it is, the more accurate it is." And it's like, no, people lied back then too. Like some people just picked up a pen in the 1800s and wrote a book about how to make money that was full of garbage and sold it to people because it made money on suckers. So, can you walk us through your writing process and how do you go about translating what you have researched into something accessible for those outside of your field?
Gosh, this was really hard coming from a critical liberal arts PhD. Like I used a lot of words in my dissertation, like heteronormativity and hegemony, like these
Hmm.
big academic words. And I've really had to learn how to do plain writing. And it's still hard for me because I'm also a vocab nerd. I like obscure old-timey words. Um, but trying to write things simply and also, choosing which stories to include and which not is a challenge. But, I just try to, I think of that principle that's like, would an eighth grader understand this? That's like I think one of the main plain language principles. I try to incorporate that. Thankfully, because I'm working with primary source material, I'm not really engaged with a lot of the academic literature. So I don't have to work on translating from that type of mindset to the everyday reader. I'm reading diary entries from 1888, which once you figure out how to read that handwriting, it's understandable. So yeah, I don't have a good answer for what's my writing process because it's kind of frenetic. It's like I find a bucket with a horse's name on it, and then I go to the library and I spend 6 hours looking in photographs, and then I find 15 more things I want to research from that trip, and then I just have to make lots of lists.
So we have heard that you're writing a book on the Roosevelts and their horses, where can we expect to find your book eventually in the future? And additionally, where can we find you on social media?
I wish I knew where to tell you where to find my book. It's still really early days, and
Okay.
I would say to just keep up with my social media. So I have an Instagram and a Facebook. They're both called Horse Historian, which I think there's a few people who go by that name out in the world. And so just, you can read, I usually have my bio description that says like studying Roosevelts and their horses. And I do dabble in, you know, horse history that's not just about the Roosevelts, but I refer to the book as like the orbit is Franklin Roosevelt and the Hudson Valley. And there's other stories that come into that, but that's really my orbit. And that's because I'm here and there's so much primary source evidence for it. So um, that's kind of my niche, even though the name is a little misleading in general. But so horse historian on Instagram and Facebook, and I'm meeting with a publisher next week.
Oh, cool.
So
Good luck.
That's so exciting, very
thank
exciting.
you. I have, I would say, probably 3 books under my wing right now. But yeah, it takes a long time, and I'm still doing
Mhm.
the research. I'm actively still in the research. I'm actively trying to, my postdoc ends in August, so I'm trying to stay here, figure out a way to stay and keep doing this. But, as far as material goes, I have enough for probably more than one book. So just stay tuned is the best I can say for
That's
now. I'm working as
exciting.
fast as I can.
All right, then. Well, thank you so much for taking your time to talk with us. And this has been
Yeah.
really cool.
Well, thank y'all so much for having me. This was really, really fun. And I love your podcast. I love your social media. I hope that you keep doing this forever and ever.
Oh, well, thank you. I hope we can keep like collaborating and stuff. I think it's super awesome because I learn a lot from you like constantly. So,
Oh, that's really nice to hear. Thank you.
thank you for listening to History from Horseback. If you are interested in Shelby's work, you can find her at Horse Historian on Facebook and Instagram. We hope that you enjoyed this episode. If you like what you heard, please consider leaving us a rating or review. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you out on the trail.